Okay. I'm assuming everybody can see my screen now. So again, my name is Deborah Chestnutt. I'm a mastered prepared nurse. I've been nursing for about 40 years, and for the most recent 12 years, I've been working with caregivers. For the past 8 years, I had a program at the Asheville VA, the Dementia Caregiver Support Program, where I got to go into the home and talk with the caregiver and meet with them 4 to 6 times over 6 months. And it was in that experience that, I learned a lot from the caregiver, but got to hear a pattern about loss and role change and grief. And that's why I chose this discussion today. Many times a caregiver would start out the conversation about how they were frustrated about something, or they were sad about something, they were angry, lots of different faces of grief. And when we started talking about what they were going through and the loss associated with that, maybe the person with dementia now couldn't, take their pills without some assistance, or get their clothes without some assistance, or now they were doing the bills, or they were having to do all the driving. When we talked about these losses as a loss and the grief associated with that, then it sort of helped them give themselves permission to take care of themselves, which is the whole purpose of this talk, is about recognizing loss and role change and the grief associated with that, and then taking care of yourself, the self-care and balancing that. How we recognize grief a lot of times is based on our own experience. Have we experienced a death, or have we experienced divorce or loss of a friendship? And that experience will weaves itself into our own experience as to how we can self-care, and I'll talk more about that. My goals today is to talk about the many faces of grief, recognizing grief and loss, to define the language of grief, and then to connect role change and loss to caring for ourselves. So first, this is the textbook definition of grief. Grief is the anguish experienced after significant loss. Grief often includes physiological distress, separation anxiety, confusion, yearning, obsessive dwelling on the past, and apprehension about the future. As a nurse, when I started reading about grief, I started recognizing how similar it was to me about when I learned about pain. When I was in nursing school, it was really hammered into us about pain is individualized. We can't tell someone how they experience pain or what their pain is like. And I think grief is the same way. We can't explain someone else's grief, how they're going to show it, how it's going to display, how they perceive it. That is an individualized experience. And also grief is based on a lot of our cultural traditions. When we think of grief, we think of maybe a death and mourning. And with that, those cultural traditions of, if someone loses someone, we give them a time to mourn. We give them food, we give them flowers, we give them a call, we check on them. And also the person that is grieving, we give ourselves time. We take care of ourselves. We set more boundaries. We're focused on sort of experiencing that grief and taking care of ourselves. And that's sort of woven into that experience. So the grief experience can be unclear as to what it looks like initially. And a lot of times we don't recognize the grief that we're experiencing. When we're caregivers, a change can happen, a role change can happen. All of a sudden our loved one is no longer able to do certain things. And we experience a lot of different emotion. We may have doubt and confusion, helplessness, anxiety about it, anger, sadness, all of these things. But when you follow that thread, it goes back to that loss. And what I want us to recognize is the grief associated with that. And the reason why this matters is that when we name something, it provides credibility, and then it normalizes our experience. So when we name, this was a loss, and I am grieving that loss, then it gives us permission to also take care of ourselves. It gives us permission to take care of me, or to recognize that I need to do a better job of taking care of me. When more things are happening, in my life where I'm experiencing more loss and role change as a result of this, then taking care of me, needs to be a part of that balance. So when I was talking to caregivers, and normally I would be asking you guys what your losses are, but we'll talk about that at the end of this. But a lot of the losses that they shared with me were loss of a partner, loss of plans for my future, loss of a normal role, loss of a confidant, loss of time alone, loss of intimacy, loss of work, loss of shared responsibility. So there were many losses, And what's happening, I think, in our culture is that, we experiencing these losses as caregivers of persons with dementia, but people are not recognizing that that's something that is going on and that we might need more support. And we have to also give ourselves permission to provide that support to ourselves. Today, maybe many of you have heard a lot of these terms. There's a lot of language for grief today. So dementia grief is that small incremental losses that are associated with cognitive loss. So those are just small incremental things that are happening. You may be the first one to notice it, but those are the small losses that are occurring. With compounded loss, that's when things are happening more frequently and more consistently and more continuous. That's when a lot of the role changes is occurring with compounded loss. When all of a sudden now you have to take care of the bills, you've got to do the house maintenance. You've never had to take care of the finances before. You're doing all the driving, you're making all the decisions. There's a lot of compounded loss. And with disenfranchised grief, that is that grief where maybe the other people around you are not recognizing this as a loss. And a lot of times people will say, my family came and visited, but they didn't see anything different. They said, oh, I think he's doing okay. But for you, you see all the little subtle changes, and so they don't get to, you're not getting the support that you were hoping you were going to get. So that's that disenfranchised grief. With ambiguous loss, and this happens, throughout the continuum, the stages, that's that uncertainty or the unpredictability of dementia. When things are happening, when you're not sure if you're supposed to help them today, or maybe you are, or, is today a good day or a bad day, things that are just unpredictable. And then there's anticipatory grief. And that's when, you're thinking, okay, so today I'm helping him with his pills. What's going to be like tomorrow? What else is going to happen? I'm going to one day have to, help him with dressing, or I'm going to have to help him with toileting, or I'm going to have to help do all the driving. It's that anticipating things to occur. So all of these things are important. It's kind of a language of grief, so that it provides that credibility for you and that permission to say, this is what's going on in my life. And hopefully with that permission, you'll take care of yourself. So things that we know about stages, and along with that, the role changes. In early stage, it's kind of like we finally got diagnosed. There's a confirmation of yes, they have dementia, and then there comes with that loss and grief, that separation from your anticipated future. Families may still not really see what you're seeing. They may reframe it or downplay it, so that you can still find that you'll still see that disenfranchised grief. And then that ambiguous loss is occurring a lot of times in the early stages. Today he's having a good day, or he sounds the same, he looks the same, but he's not responding the same. So it's that sort of unpredictability. With middle stage, again, there's a lot of those compounded losses. They're happening fast and frequently. All of a sudden, you're not able to he's not able to do many things. He used to always go out in the workshop and he would spend his day out there. Now, he's sitting in the house and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with him. I'm having to do all the bills. I've got to, do all of these things. That is a time when it was a we to our scenario, and now it becomes an I. And then there's the anticipatory grief, as things progress, what else is going to happen? What else is going to change? And with all of these are role changes. And so with every role change, we have to work towards that caregiver balance. So for everything that we have on one side of the coin, where we're having to, remind or pay the bills or do or perform activities of daily living, on the other side of that coin, we have to weave into our lives other things that can really help us to keep this balance. And I've listed on here, use time savers and worry helpers that I'm going to talk about. Use family and friends, daily time for me, plan a respite, but you're having to make sure you're balancing that situation so that you are really taking care of yourself as much as you can, frequently, continuously, and every day in some moment. That's really going to, help you manage over time. But it's through recognizing loss and role change as grief that gives us often that permission to do this. So again, with what we can do to balance in the early stages, a lot of times it's doing what you're doing today, and that's that you've circled the wagons, you've created a community where you can get validated and supported. And so attending support groups are really good, talking to your neighbors, telling your neighbors, that your loved one has dementia, so that you've got more dementia eyes, that are following your loved one if needed. Being proactive, get educated. The last time we talked, I talked about the importance of understanding the brain and really understanding what's going on with the brain so that you know what to expect. And this would counteract those feelings of ambiguous loss, of that uncertainty, do I or don't I? And then me time, the balance. And, I talk about practice mindfulness, and I'll talk more about what that really means in appreciating those small personal time moments. So mindfulness, I just, in case people don't really know what that is, mindfulness is a type of meditation in which you focus on being intensely aware of what you're sensing and feeling in the moment without interpreting or judging. This is the Mayo Clinic definition. Practicing mindfulness involves breathing methods, guided imagery, or other practices. There's lots of tools out there to help you practice mindfulness. And I'm going to be like a lot of you. It's like, oh, mindfulness, I don't do that kind of thing. But once I sort of found the right resource for myself, and there's lots of them out there, just taking a minute when I am feeling very stressed, or when I'm in the middle of when I was caregiving, repeated questions, or where are you, what's going on, not having that moment of time by yourself, being able to take those deep breaths and just focus on my breath or the sounds around me when I walk out in the yard and hear the birds, when I would just stay literally in that moment, even for a moment, it became my moment. And that's really what mindfulness is. You really are able to just really focus on yourself for that moment and just shut everything else out. And that sort of resets you for a moment. So I highly recommend mindfulness, because it might be that you can't get out of the house or you can't leave, but mindfulness, you can leave in the moment. In middle stages, again, there's a lot of compounded loss. This is, again, where community support is vital, and also identifying those people that can help you, time for respite. And then I talked about worry helpers. Worry helpers are things like using cameras in the home, using baby monitors so that you can hear what's going on, so that it allows you to work outside in the garage or in the yard. Motion sensors, so if there's certain areas that there could be a dangerous situation, so that you're notified. And so the more eyes or sensors you have on, the less anxiety you have to have, because you've got it covered. Letting neighbors know, using things like stove knob covers if you don't want them to cook, cabinet locks if there's certain things you don't want them to get to, distraction tools, using music, I say redundant TV shows. Sometimes she used the same, playing the same TV show over and over is really much more calming in the later stages than having news on or flipping channels, that kind of thing, keeping things very consistent. If you are making yourself really aware of what causes your loved one anxiety and then decreasing that, you know, like if news is one of those triggers, or if too many people is one of those triggers, so limiting the number of people that come over, maybe come over one at a time, and then using those helpers that will give you additional eyes so that you don't have to be the only person taking care of that. Those are good things to help balance those compounded losses. This was something I just wanted to share with you. As I said, I've been a caregiver too. My mom died though about, I guess it's 10 years ago, but I was taking care of her with Lewy body. And at that time, for me, I journaled a lot. And so I want to read an excerpt from my journal that really talks about this loss and role change that I was experiencing. And I'll have to read this. So, this is what I wrote in my journal. I saw my primary physician this week. I confess there was no physical reason for me to do so, none that I couldn't manage myself. When I pushed the button on my home phone to hear the messages, I had an opportunity that I could cancel this appointment, but I don't. Sitting in the small white waiting room, waiting for my doctor, I remember being here so many times with my dad. I was caregiving. And I'll stop here just to say that when I brought my mom and dad up here to Durham, and so my dad had vascular issues, multiple heart surgeries, that kind of thing. So he was in assisted living, and my mom was in the nursing home next to them. She no longer could walk. She didn't recognize me for the most part, or I thought she didn't. And so I was taking care of them, but I was taking my dad back and forth to the doctor too. So going back to my excerpt, the doctor opens the door and says, hello. I say hi, and immediately my mouth reveals I am still caregiving. I think to myself, is this a cry for help? No further exchange is given, and we go into the real reason that I'm here. My hip pain, my eyelid growth, nothing new. He's puzzled, but he's pleasant, and he's offering me physical therapy and reassurance the growth isn't cancerous. Do you want to remove it? No, I say. Do you want PT? No. And silently, I'm screaming, I want to not be a caregiver. I want to be a daughter again. I want that familiar anger and tension with my mom. She was strong. She could take whatever I had. We knew our roles, and this role change is too hard. Do you have something for that? No. So I wanted to share that because that was my experience with role change and loss and grieving. So anyway, my takeaway message is role change. If there is a role change, if you can recognize the loss associated with that, and as you recognize it as grief, increase your own self-care and your own me time. Thank you for your time.